Make it plain.
Make it plain.
MIP.
With Masamela Matfumo.
Mark Thompson.
Make it plain.
Get woke.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another edition of Make It Plain. My guest today has a very timely book. It is entitled On Treason, A Citizen's Guide to the Law. My guest, the author, is a Martin Luther King Jr. professor of law at University of California, Davis School of Law, where he teaches American constitutional law and English and American legal history. He's a graduate of Harvard College and Yale Law School, and he is one of the nation's leading authorities on the law of treason. Carlton F.W. Larson is here on Make It Plain. Dr. Larson, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Happy to be here. It's
a pleasure to have you. So why now? What motivated you to publish this book in this moment, in this era?
Donald Trump. Yeah, treason was something I've been interested in for a long time, probably about 25 years now, as a scholarly matter, and I was interested in the history of it, and so I wrote my first book about the history of treason law during the American Revolution. And as a result of that, once Donald Trump started becoming politically prominent, I started getting calls from the media asking about questions about treason. And this was a new thing because I hadn't received those during the Obama presidency or the Bush presidency. And the questions were essentially, did Donald Trump commit treason? And turned out people had a lot of concerns and questions about his behavior and were curious about what treason was. And then Trump himself started accusing everybody under the sun of treason, including mostly his political opponents. And so I realized that this was a subject that people were now talking about a lot. But there was a lot of just misinformation floating around out there, and it would be useful to have a book for non-lawyers that would sort of lay out the law of treason as clearly and as concisely as possible, so that everybody could understand, what is treason and what is not.
Treason, am I correct, is the only crime spelled out in the Constitution per se?
That's right. It's the only crime that actually has a definition directly in the Constitution, and that's in Article 3. And so treason is limited to levying war against the United States or adhering to its enemies, giving them aid and comfort.
Okay. So you have found and you believe that Donald Trump has committed treason or is currently committing treason?
Neither one. I think Donald Trump has done a lot of exceptionally bad things, and he has but certainly betrayed the country, I think, in many ways. But nothing that I've seen actually meets the constitutional definition of treason.
Okay. But is there, and as you mentioned, he's done a lot of questionable things, and he's projected treason on a lot of people. In that, the definition is laid out in the Constitution. Are there lesser crimes which fall under treason for which he should be held accountable? I mean, there's first-degree murder, there's third-degree murder. Is there first-degree treason versus third-degree treason, so to speak?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and when I say something isn't treason, that doesn't mean it's okay. That doesn't mean that it's not a crime. It just means that it can't be prosecuted under that particular heading. And so there's a lot of crimes out there that cover disloyalty. I mean, the typical one is espionage. If you think about the Rosenberg, they're executed for passing nuclear secrets to the Soviet Union. That wasn't technically a treason case, but it was a very serious, problem of national security and breach of loyalty. So there are a whole bunch of crimes that potentially, one could look at with respect to Donald Trump. It's just that treason wouldn't be one of them.
So do you have a sense of what some of those crimes might be? Have you looked at those?
Well, I mean, one of the things one can look at is the Mueller report, where there's what seems to me to be pretty clear evidence of obstruction of justice. I mean, I don't want to necessarily squarely say that that a particular person committed a particular crime without actually having seen the evidence upon which that claim would rest. And so part of the problem is we don't know for sure, what exactly Donald Trump has done. We don't know what conversations he's had. We don't know what exactly was done with his financial entanglements. We don't know what the taxes situation is. But if I were Donald Trump and I were contemplating leaving office, I would be worried. That there might be possible criminal liability based either on what he did in office or what he did prior to becoming president.
So you don't want to accuse anyone of a crime without seeing evidence. Kind of like people are saying, don't accuse every state of election fraud without evidence, right? It's kind of the same.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I would say the same thing to Donald Trump. You don't go around accusing people of treason, without evidence either.
Right. Yeah. No, that's important. Well, this is interesting. Let's talk a little bit about, because you obviously delve into the history of treason as well. There's as I'm sure you're aware, there's a very popular, and I love it, very popular new series on Showtime about John Brown, The Good Lord Bird. I don't know if you've seen it or not.
I haven't seen it yet. No, I don't get Showtime, but I'm eager to watch it.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting, and it's sort of a comedy, sort of a dark comedy too. But there's obviously renewed interest in John Brown, so your book is also timely in that regard. He was executed for treason, correct?
Yes, so he was actually prosecuted for treason against the state of Virginia. He'd assembled his men in Maryland and then crossed the river into what was then the state of West Virginia. Then the state of Virginia, which is now Harper's Ferry, West Virginia. And the state of Virginia charged him with levying war against the state of Virginia. And this is one of those pockets of treason law that isn't often very well understood, but states can prosecute treason as well as the federal government, at least with respect to levying war cases. So if you try to overthrow a state government by armed force, there's a good chance you could be subject to a state treason prosecution. And Brown was one of two people, along with his one of his co-fighters, Edwin Cobbock, who was actually executed for that crime.
Yeah. As far as what happened subsequently, the Civil War, should members of the Confederacy have been tried or charged with treason?
That was a tough decision, because if you think about it, essentially every person fighting in the Confederate Army or anyone who gave them support had committed treason against the United States. And you're talking about hundreds of thousands of people. And so the likelihood of trying all of them and in theory, imprisoning them or even executing them, you're just not going to end a civil war with that kind of a bloodbath. So the real issue is whether you should take a few handful of top people and sort of make an example of them. So Robert E. Lee, he was probably saved by General Grant at Appomattox. Grant granted very generous surrender terms that probably precluded a treason prosecution. And so clearly the prime target really would have been Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy. And he was someone who actually was indicted for treason, but ultimately escaped. President Johnson gave him a pardon after an adverse legal ruling from Chief Justice Salmon Chase. And so it's unclear whether he would have ultimately been convicted or not. There were problems. It would have been a Virginia jury. Would they have been willing to convict him? And so ultimately no person was convicted for treason as a result of the Civil War.
It's actually interesting that America was actually kind of founded, wasn't it, on a treasonous act, or vis-a-vis a treasonous act, was it not? Yes,
absolutely. I mean, the American Revolution is an act of treason against Great Britain. I mean, there's no question under English law that the leaders of the revolution were levying war against the king, which was treason under English law.
Is there any irony then, I guess, in what's written in the Constitution with regards to treason?
Well, in some ways, you might say here you had people who committed treason themselves writing a provision about treason, and that can seem perhaps a little odd. On the other hand, I think it wasn't just the war itself, but it was what led up to it, and that was a lot of protests over British policies, protests over British taxes, and the colonists were accused by British officials of committing treason, and were threatened with being hauled to England and tried for treason there, where they wouldn't have the protections of a local jury. And so they worried a lot about treason being abused by government, that this is one of those crimes when a government is sort of out of control. Innocent people really are going to suffer. And so I think the treason clause was meant to prevent the type of abuses that they actually saw as potentially happening that to themselves during the period leading up to the revolution.
So prosecutions for treason have been somewhat rare, have they not?
Extremely rare. In our since the Constitution was adopted, I would guess there's probably fewer than 50 cases that have actually been prosecuted. It's not totally clear because we don't have precise numbers, because there may be things lurking in records that have been overlooked. But since the early 1950s, there's only been one indictment, and that was Adam Gadon, who was indicted in 2006 for serving as an Al-Qaeda spokesperson.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Does that add up for you that there have been so few? Have you found that there were cases eligible for treason charges that should have taken place? Have there been too few or too many?
Well, I mean, I suppose you could say if there were a lot more, I could make some money on the side doing treason law. But I just tell you, that's a field that really just doesn't generate a lot of outside consulting business. But no, actually, I think that this shows that the thing is working correctly. If we lived in a world where people are being prosecuted for treason all the time, that would be actually quite worrisome. I do think there's a handful of cases where we probably could have brought a treason charge, probably most notably the Oklahoma City bombers. I think did levy war against the United States. The problem there was that treason also requires two witnesses to the same overt act, and that's written into the Constitution. And so you would have had to find two people who saw the Oklahoma City bombers do that, and that would have been tricky. So I think that's often what happens is prosecutors will take a look at this, conclude that it's just too difficult given that two witness requirement, but they've got a ton of other charges. So I mean, the Oklahoma City people were put away for a very long time, and that's almost always going to be the case with some of these treason charges, that it's hard to commit treason without also committing a bunch of other crimes along the way.
You mentioned the treason law field. You're a law professor. Is treason law even regularly taught in law school?
No, it's not. I don't even teach it. I mentioned it a little bit to my students, but I suppose I could try to offer a course on it, but it strikes me as this too self-indulgent. It's not something they're really likely to need in actual practice, so I should probably spend my time teaching something else.
But I don't know. I mean, I think it might be popular under the circumstances for the same reason you were getting all these phone calls about treason. Who knows?
Yeah. Well, I think it would be a fun class. I would love to do it. I just have to persuade my deans that that's worth doing.
Yeah. As you said, you don't believe the evidence necessarily exists to charge Donald Trump with treason directly, but he has come close to the threshold. Do you have any thoughts about the pending legal cases that are facing him? There's a lot of conversation about how many cases there are once he leaves office. Do you have any? And those aren't about treason either. But when you look at it cumulatively, it looks pretty bad.
Yep, I think he's going to be spending a lot of money on lawyers when he leaves office, and I hope those lawyers take the money up front, because we know one thing he does: he never pays his bills. And I would be very reluctant to represent Donald Trump without a big fat payment right up front, because I think he's got serious tax problems. He's got potential state criminal liability in New York. He's got a whole host of civil suits that are floating around out there, including sexual assault suits and a libel suit. And so he's going to be busy.
Yeah, yeah. But let's go back for a minute, because I know you teach English as well. Treason. Let's define that, because that's the crime. But to me, the adjective can be even more, it can have a broader definition. Treasonous behavior, so to speak. Am I wrong about that?
No, that's certainly true. People sort of use the term in both a legal sense and in a colloquial sense. And I think the term traitor is often used much more broadly colloquially. I mean, you might refer to a business partner who leaves you for a competitor. You might refer to them as a traitor, or a cheating spouse you might refer to as a traitor. Or, the sports star who goes to the other team, you'd say they're a traitor. And so people sort of just use it as a generic term for betrayal. Where it gets tricky is when we're talking about these types of national betrayal, and it can often be a lot of imprecision in terms of whether they're just talking about sort of someone who sort of undermined the country more generally, or someone who actually committed, this very, very serious crime. That's
very interesting, because when we think about it, I think it is easy to throw the colloquialism around, as many have done. And let's face it, as you said, he's done it himself. Has your book been helpful in answering some of the questions you've gotten on those phone calls?
Well, I certainly hope so. And I think, if people read the book, they'll have a much better sense of what is treason and what is not. The law is complicated. There's no question about that. But the book does try to sort of explain, where the complications are, what are the sort of the easy cases, what are the harder cases, and what are the areas where, there really is some legal gray area where you could imagine a court going either way. And that's important, because a lot of times these things just aren't clear cut. Sometimes they are, sometimes they aren't. And then the real difficulty is figuring out, well, what are the easy cases and what are the hard cases?
I understand, and congratulations on the high honor of being a Martin Luther King Jr. scholar. There were those in his day who considered him a traitor.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is one of those charges that people protesting against government are routinely tarred with throughout our history, and those charges are almost always wrong. So that's one of the reasons we have to be very careful with this, is that we think about all the ways in which this has been abused in the past. We don't want to repeat those mistakes again. Yeah.
Lastly, you mentioned some of the other things, like, for example, espionage, the Mueller report. And I know you said you haven't seen all of the evidence, but might there have been a strong case to have been made that Donald Trump may have been working even with another government, Russia in a sense, in this instance, to undermine the federal government? In other words, do you think the Mueller report went far enough? Did you look at that and see it as somehow being hampered, as some felt it was, that it didn't really go to its full completion? What were your thoughts about that?
So, there's sort of two parts to the Mueller report. The first part dealing with the Russia connections, and then the second part dealing with obstruction of justice. I didn't see anything in part one of the report that really creates an explicit link between Trump himself and Russia. Now, it does draw connections between many of his associates, people who worked on his campaign, who were clearly in touch with Russia. But remember, part two is about obstruction of justice, meaning that Trump did things to impede the Mueller report and make it harder for them to gather information. So that doesn't mean that there isn't such information. It means that they weren't able to find it. And it's possible that such information will come out. Now, is Donald Trump an active Russian agent? My guess is no. My guess is that Russia views him more as sort of a useful idiot, as a person who can be manipulated into doing things that are beneficial to them. And for some reason, he does seem to have this infatuation with Putin that is really inexplicable. So there may be something there. Maybe they have intelligence dirt on him. Maybe they have some financial hook on him. It's hard to know, but I would just be completely speculating. I really have no factual basis for that. And so it's just, all we can say is that there's sort of some odd behavior, and it would be very interesting to know what's really going on.
So your phone was ringing on treason. Are you also getting phone calls about the peaceful transfer of power and transition according to the Constitution?
So far, not. I'm hopeful that it will all go smoothly. We'll see.
Yeah. I've had a couple of discussions on that myself, and it says at 12 o'clock on January 20th. It's pretty ironclad, so we'll see what happens. Yeah. Carlton F.W. Larson's book is entitled On Treason, A Citizen's Guide to the Law. And let me just emphasize, he's a law professor, but this is not an academic law or law school book, correct? This is for the layperson like us, right?
That's right, exactly. This is meant for someone who has, no training in law, but is just kind of interested in it. And I think it has, it has a lot of stories that can help put all this law in context.
Yeah, so it's very helpful and informative in that regard. Congratulations on the book, Professor Larson.
Well, thank you.
All right, thank you for being here.
Thank you, very much enjoyed it.
Thanks for getting woke and listening to Make It Plain. Please remember to listen, like, subscribe, and wherever you get your podcasts, please give the show a 5-star rating. And please do spread the word. Let's all continue to pray for each other during this pandemic and this police-demic. If all hearts and minds are clear, it has been made plain.